Hey everybody, welcome to For Food's Sake, the podcast bringing you down-to-earth dialogues about the food on your plate and its many impacts on people and the planet. My name is Matteo De Vos, and without further ado, let's talk about food. This week I talked to Robert Nathan Allen, also known as RNA, about edible insects. RNA is the founder of Little Herds, which is an educational nonprofit based in Austin, Texas, that teaches and spreads awareness about edible insects as a resource-efficient, economically viable, nutritious, but also as a delicious food for us to eat, and as a feed for the animal products that we consume. So in this episode, we'll be exploring the enormous potential that edible insects have. We'll be looking at how we can incorporate them into Western diets and into food systems, and how they can meet current and future nutritional and environmental demands and needs of a growing world population. So we'll explore the role and importance that edible insects have had historically across different societies and cultures, and then also kind of dive into the Western taboos towards insects and where those come from and how we might be able to overcome those. We'll even have a live on-air taster session where I try eating insects for the very first time to help challenge these taboos and as part of the For Food's Sake Learn by Doing initiative of practicing what we preach. We'll look in more detail about the nutrition of edible insects and compare them to some of the more standard Western diet alternatives in terms of meat. And then we'll be going into more depth on the sustainability side of things. So looking at edible insects, their feed conversion ratio, the amount of land they use and the amount of water they use, and compare that to more traditional livestock industries. We'll also explore the possibilities of eating insects as vegetarians or as vegans. So we'll be looking into some of the ethical arguments there are of eating insects. We'll explore how insects can be used as a form of recycling and the fact that they're fed on organic waste streams. And then we'll also look at insects as feed. So feed for our livestock, feed for fish, feed for chickens, and what role they play there. We look at the economic opportunities that insects provide for certain societies and for vulnerable populations and people. And then finally, of course, we address some of the criticisms and concerns, right? So how do we overcome a scenario in which this new and exciting industry, full of promise and possibilities, becomes one that's overexploited and hijacked by big agribusiness, like has happened to so many other potential foods, potential solutions? Then we look at some of the academic critiques, or at least concerns raised in certain articles about the sustainability of eating insects. And then finally, we finish off with some recommendations from RNA about what we can all do as conscious consumers with edible insects to live a more sustainable lifestyle. So without further ado, I'm super excited to bring to you on the show RNA from Edible Insects. RNA, great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having us on. Really excited to be able to share some more information about this exciting new world.
Yeah, it definitely is exciting. But before we get into kind of everything to do with edible insects and how useful they can be on so many different levels, could you maybe explain to the listeners out there what we mean by edible insects?
Sure. So when we're talking about edible insects, we're really generally talking about insects that can be consumed by humans for food. But we could also broadly be speaking of insects that could be used for livestock feed or a pet feed as well. So when we're distinguishing between those food insects and feed insects, one term that we found that's rather useful in giving those food connotations is insect cuisine.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. The fact that you don't, I guess, it's not just you eating the insects, but it could also be the food of your food, right? So that it could be the animals, right? That's
and to be clear, we're not talking about necessarily going out in your backyard and picking up a bug or a bug that you might find in your house.
Right.
It's important to distinguish the insects that we're eating are either harvested by someone who's very knowledgeable about insects in the wild and which ones are safe to eat versus potentially dangerous, and or even just having insects that are farmed specifically for human consumption.
Right. And so how did you, personally, get involved in eating bugs?
Yeah, I was a bartender in Austin in 2012, and I don't have any background in science or farming or food science but my mom sent me a video as a joke talking about eating insects and said, "This looks like something wild you and your dad would try." No thanks. And I thought it was really cool. The video talked about the nutrition of insects. It talked about the resource efficiency in farming them. It talked about the importance to traditional cultures around the world as a food. And it talked about the idea of abstracting insects for hesitant Western consumers. And it was, for me, it was like a light bulb going off. This is this incredible resource that has been, completely ignored by our Western food culture. And so I started, just really diving into researching the idea, learning everything I could about it. And over the next year, I was cold calling entomology departments and saying, "Hey, I'm a bartender in Austin and I want to serve bugs. What do I do?" And got some pretty interesting replies, but one that always sticks out for me is I had a professor who said, "Look, don't tell anybody, but I serve insects every semester. At the last day of class, I cook up a bunch of bugs at home. I bring them to class. The students love it. Everybody has a good time, but please don't tell anybody because I don't want the university to shut it down."
Right.
And it really surprised me that someone would have to slink around in the shadows because we have such an ingrained taboo against this idea in society that it's not even considered. And so consequently, I got introduced to some of the folks within academia that have been talking about this idea for decades. Folks like David Gracer, one of the founders for the Food Insect Newsletter, one of the longest running websites on edible insects, and folks like Tiny Farms and Pat Crowley of Chapul, who was starting the first cricket protein bar on Kickstarter. And as I met these entrepreneurs who were taking this idea and putting it into action, I realized that there was a real lack of publicly available resources. I had to hunt so much for the information that I could find. And so in 2013, we founded Little Herds as a 501c3 educational nonprofit to provide that resource to the public. We wanted people to know why they should consider trying a cricket protein bar or why they should eat a Chapulina's grasshopper taco in a restaurant, all the nutritional benefits and the resource benefits. And so we created Little Herds to be that resource to the public, to parents, to educators, policymakers, entrepreneurs, researchers, and to really provide a platform to just get this idea out there.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting. I mean, you touched upon the issue specifically, I guess, of a lack of information in the Western world and the fact that it's very much still, I guess, a taboo, right? I mean, like you said, you're reaching out to different professors and some you were getting positive responses from, but I guess from other people, I mean, it's still a very much a taboo topic. It's considered, I guess, rather, some people consider eating insects primitive. It's got these connotations with, being, disgusting, being part, pests, diseases. You think of malaria, you think of maggots, you think of all these, insects, have a bad name in that way.
Absolutely. And there's been some really great research that's looked into, this disgust factor, the ick factor. And there's a lot of, evolutionary basis there. If we're eating something that is going to make us sick as a species, we incorporate that into our food culture that you don't eat that because it's going to make you sick.
Right.
And if you have, maggots on your meat, then that meat may have spoiled. But what we really see, if we look into it on an anthropological level, there are so many places in the world where insects are still consumed, and contrary to the common misconception that you mentioned, the idea that this is a food of necessity or a food of last recourse or a food that is barbaric. These are really Western misconceptions. In fact, most places in the world where insects are consumed, they're beloved. It's a traditional food. It's a comfort food, delicacy even. Yeah, and so around the world, in places that don't ascribe to the traditional Western food culture, we do see this tradition continued and celebrated throughout the centuries. And even on looking further back, there's a lot of really interesting research into, from an anthropological perspective and an evolutionary perspective, how did our ancestors, early primates, how were they as they began to incorporate insects into their diet, as they began to walk upright and be able to use their hands for collecting insects on the move, or using primitive tools to get termites out of a termite mound in the same way that we see modern primates doing. Could it be that these beneficial fats and proteins and vitamins and minerals that are found in insects that aren't necessarily found in fruits and vegetables and nuts, could it be that contributed to the growth of our brain and our capacity to think, and over time became part of our diet, to the point where now we know that a lot of these nutrients and proteins are so important for proper brain development and function.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a very important point to start on is nutrition. Right. Is the fact that not just historically, but even today, I mean, there's a very strong argument to be made that we should be consuming edible insects just for the fact that it's such a rich source of micronutrients, of protein, of vitamins.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when we're talking about nutrition, protein is usually what comes to the forefront of the conversation when we're talking about edible insects, but that's really just the start of the conversation. They do have an incredible protein. They've got a really high amount of protein per body mass, and a really great amino acid profile. But beyond that, they've got incredibly high levels of important things like iron and calcium and magnesium.
Right.
A lot of the vitamins and minerals like copper and zinc and niacin that you're really not going to find a lot of in traditional livestock proteins outside of fish or seafood, shellfish. And it's really no surprise then that insects have a lot of nutritional similarity with something like seafood and shellfish. We think of fish as being a very lean, healthy protein.
Right.
Insects are genetically very similar to crustaceans, other arthropods, like shrimp and lobster and crawfish. They have a similar exoskeleton. And one thing that's always important to note for folks that have never tried insects is that if you have a shellfish allergy, you may want to consult your physician before you try this, because, like I said, genetically they're similar.
Right.
And there's still a lot of research that needs to be done into allergenicity. But that seafood comparison, is a really poignant one. And when we talk about using insects as a food, compared to other animals that we eat, we're able to use a lot more of the body mass of the insect, and so consequently we're really usually eating the entire insect,
Right.
or we're taking the entire insect and we're grinding it into a powder that can then be incorporated into foods. And when the insects are processed like this, when they're cooked or dry roasted, for instance, a lot of that water weight comes out, and what you get is either a whole insect or an insect powder that's incredibly nutritionally dense, that has much higher levels of protein gram for gram than any of our normal protein sources. More than chicken breast, more than beef jerky, even comparable levels to something like soy or whey protein isolates, which really don't have a lot of nutritional value beyond
Right.
that protein. And yet with the insects, we've got this way to fortify foods and increase their nutritional content without changing their look, feel, and taste.
And then in terms of not just protein, but also, fat content you touched upon, I think people tend to, at least fish is the kind of go-to for getting your unsaturated omega-3s and your 6 fatty acids. But I saw in a study, I think it was the 2013 UN Food and Agricultural Study on edible insects, talked about mealworms having these comparable levels. So that's something that I totally didn't know, and that really stuck out to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more we're really learning about nutrition and how nutrition works for us in general and us individually, and how it works with our gut biome, we're learning more and more about how important these poly and monounsaturated fats are, and having the right ratio of omega-3s to omega-6s. And insects fit really well within what we know about what really makes a food nutritional for us. And one of the other interesting things with insects is that they provide fiber through their exoskeleton,
Right.
which is really unusual in that there's really no other animal proteins that provide fiber in that way.
Yeah, and before I forget, I mean, you also touched upon the kind of comparison between lobsters and insects, and I think that's something really interesting that we should touch upon, is the fact that kind of, I mean, historically speaking, at least in the West, lobster is something that was, not always seen as a delicacy in the way that it might be seen today. And I think that's something really interesting too, right? Is that there's this kind of element of a change in the Western diet, and that maybe insects could go down a similar route almost.
Absolutely. Yeah. If we look at, and there's so many great examples of Western food trends changing. It's not a static idea. The lobster example in the mid 1800s, that was something that you didn't eat unless you had no other option. You fed lobsters to prisoners and servants, and it was something, if you had lobster shells outside your house, it was a sign of that you couldn't afford anything else. And it's really no surprise, because the people who were living on the Northeast coast and at the time, the lobsters were much bigger. They were much more plentiful. They would wash up on the shore, and it was seen as a kind of a cockroach of the sea. They would grind up lobsters and throw it on their garden for fertilizer. It was not something that was that you would deign to eat unless you were forced to. And it really wasn't until the railroad started connecting people from the interior to the coast, where you could have someone that could take a trip to the coast who was affluent enough to afford a train ticket. And if they came back with a tin of lobster meat, that was something that was so unique and exotic and classy for the people who'd never seen this before. And there weren't those negative connotations attached to it. So you start to see this transformation of the idea of lobster going from a poor food to a delicacy, because it didn't have that stigma attached to it already. Fast forward a little bit when Chinese food was first introduced to America, it was something that was so completely foreign, nobody would eat it. But as chefs started to really tailor it to the American diet, the idea of General Tso's chicken is a great example of, make it sweeter, make it saltier, and Americans will like it, and it worked, and we really incorporated it into our broader food culture. Sushi is another great example. In the 1960s, raw fish was dangerous and disgusting. That was common knowledge, and it wasn't until and sushi was not getting traction with the chefs that were trying it, until they started to really tailor it to the American diet and do things that could introduce the idea, like a California roll that didn't have the raw fish. So it introduced sushi without that negative reaction. And it wasn't until people started to see celebrities and movie stars and Hollywood elites going out to these new sushi restaurants, where it started to become desirable and aspirational and exotic, and people wanted to try this new food. And over time, that trickled down, and over the course of a generation. For instance, I grew up with sushi being something that was just kind of seen as normal. Albeit something that was, reserved for a celebration maybe, but certainly not something that was dangerous or disgusting. And then even more recently, we see our food trends able to change with something like kale. Kale, 15 years ago, it was the garnish on the salad bar. Nobody ate kale. It just looked nice. And now it's a superfood, and you can find it in all sorts of different foods. And so we have these different reasons over our food history of why we've changed our food culture. And some of them are, like the lobster, and sushi. It's kind of aspirational, wanting to feel like you're eating a little classier. Or with kale, adopting it into the diet strictly for health reasons, even though it doesn't necessarily taste all that great. There's a really great example from World War II. In the 1940s, the U.S. was so concerned with a protracted land war in Europe, and they were concerned that the population would start to become protein deficient as we were sending the majority of our quality meats to the troops.
Right.
And so the government enlisted prominent scientists and sociologists and psychologists of the time, like Margaret Mead, and had them look at how can we convince people to use some of these food resources that we don't use, the liver, the kidneys, the giblets, the offal, the organ meats.
Right.
And you see them putting these ideas out there through, the home gardening magazines with recipes for housewives, and that's where you start to see things like liver and onions and meatloaf and these sorts of dishes that were designed almost intentionally to shift food culture for patriotic reasons. We want you to cook meatloaf for your family because it is using all of these resources and it's providing more meat for our troops, for America.
That's really interesting. And maybe, before we get into the kind of environmental side of things, the sustainability side of things with edible insects, which might be, I guess, kind of the argument we can, one of the main arguments we can use to promote edible insects. But before we do that, I thought it was interesting as well. You were touching upon the kind of Westernization of, these different foods. So, the Westernization of sushi into the California roll, the same with Chinese food. Do you see edible insects kind of going down the same route in the sense that we're seeing, I guess we're not always consuming edible insects in its kind of whole form, but we're also seeing it, being incorporated into beef patties, or just being a patty, or in the form of protein bars, or in the form of protein powder. Is that definitely a trend?
And I think that's kind of it's a way for us to introduce the idea in a more approachable form for American consumers that do have that entrenched psychological taboo against it. And it's not surprising that most people in America are averse to the idea of eating bugs because we've been told our entire lives, don't put that in your mouth.
Right.
Whereas in other countries, it's always been a traditional food, so it's no big surprise. One of the things that we have seen as we've looked at different places in the world where insects are traditionally consumed, especially those places where it's not a food of necessity, it's a food that is revered and held within a high regard for its its understood health benefits. If you eat this food more often, you get sick less more often, or if your children eat this food more often, they grow up to be stronger. If you're a pregnant woman and you eat this food, you're more likely to have stronger babies. There's this traditional knowledge there. And what we've seen with the kind of the export of Western food culture, younger generations in a lot of these places, in part through the connectivity of globalization and the internet, a lot of these younger generations are foregoing those traditional foods and saying, no, this is something that poor people eat. This is something that people in the country eat. This is something that grandmother and grandpa ate. I don't want to eat that. I want to eat hamburgers and pizza and tacos. And by kind of flipping that on its head and coming from the U.S. saying, no, look, you were right. Your traditions were spot on. We're the idiots for ignoring this food. Grandmother knew what she was talking about all along. We are now rediscovering insects, whereas you knew what was going on all along. And we can hopefully start to curtail that trend and really empower these younger generations and say, no, look, you should be embracing these traditions and looking at them as a way to move forward with a better food system. So yeah, there's I think a lot of really great reasons why the adoption of insects into the food culture can have these myriad ripple effects spilling out. And it's when we talk to people in the U.S., we make it clear, look, it's normal if you don't want to eat bugs. That's perfectly okay. Right. And that's where we have the idea of abstraction as an introductory measure. It's a lot easier to convince someone to eat a chocolate chip cookie made with cricket flour than it might be to get someone to eat just a dry roasted whole cricket.
Definitely.
And so through that abstraction, and we're not trying to trick people. We're not trying to give them something and then say, you ate bugs. We're very clear that this is made with bugs. We're proud of the fact that this is made with bugs because it is more nutritious.
Right.
It's going to look the same. It's going to feel the same. It's going to taste the same, smell the same. but it's going to have more nutrition in there. And if we take that idea and we put it into a lot of the staple foods we know and love, like chips and cookies and crackers and breads and pastas and tortillas and chips and protein shakes and pancakes, and we've got all these different ways to add it into our diet. We often talk about a top-down and bottom-up approach to normalizing this idea. And the top-down approach is really similar to sushi. We want to find chefs that are looking for a new ingredient, looking for something that's a culinary vista to explore, because those chefs are going to make this something that's desirable and aspirational. Plus, if you go into your favorite restaurant where the chef always makes amazing food, you're a lot more likely to try something with insects than, say, I walk up to you in the street with a cricket cookie and you call me a crazy hippie. The reverse of that, and just like sushi, the idea is that as chefs are putting this on their menus in high-end restaurants, as celebrities are talking about eating insects, everything from Selma Hayek on David Letterman talking about growing up in Mexico and eating escamoles and chapulines, with Terry Crews doing a BuzzFeed video with a protein shake, and he surprises taste testers and says, "Look, it's cricket protein." And they go, "Oh, how could you do this to us, Terry?" And he says, No, look, it's the best protein in the world. I'm drinking it too. Look." Or Questlove, drummer for The Roots, Instagrams himself taking with a plate full of crickets and says Questlove's eating crickets and it's not a dare. And millions of Instagram followers see that. In these ways, from a top-down approach, we make it more acceptable and approachable and engaging for people to experience. And then the bottom-up approach is that abstraction. Using it in all of these staple foods, you don't have to change your diet to get the benefits of edible insects. And so we can start to put that nutritious food especially into the hands of people who really need it most. The 1 in 5 households in America that's growing up food insecure, the 1 in 4 children who's growing up in America in a food insecure household. If we can take your breakfast cereal and make it more nutritious and your kid still loves it, that's a win-win-win.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's and then I feel we've barely even scratched the surface, because that's just the nutritional side of things, right? And the way I kind of approach this first, and I think this is something we really should get into, is the sustainability side of it, right? So I became a vegetarian a little over a year ago. Predominantly, not so much for the ethical reasons as for the environmental reasons. Just the livestock industry in general, just being incredibly inefficient and contributing to, 18% of greenhouse gases, they're saying. So from that perspective, edible insects is just another fantastic solution, right?
Yes. Before we dive into the resource efficiency, you touched on vegetarianism, which, as someone who is promoting this idea in Austin, Texas, we have a large number of vegetarian and vegan consumers. And one of the interesting things that we found is that a lot of vegetarians are really open to this idea. Right. And if you are vegan, or if you're a vegetarian for moral or philosophical or religious reasons, because you don't want to eat a living, a sentient living creature, we totally understand and respect that. But like you mentioned, if you're a vegetarian for health reasons, you're trying to cut out red meat and unhealthy meats. If you're a vegetarian for environmental reasons, because you see all of the negative impacts from our agricultural system, or even if you're a vegetarian for the humane treatment of animals. Right. On all three of those, insects provides a viable alternative. We've already discussed the nutritional benefits. We can get to the animal rights aspect down the line. Right. But yes, from an environmental perspective, insects are just incredibly, incredibly efficient compared to any other livestock. And that's partly because they're an insect. Right. Because they're cold-blooded, they're not having to regulate their own temperature, so they're not using all of that energy to keep themselves, their body heat constant. So instead, they're able to, and really they're designed, not to live a long, healthy life. They're designed to breed like crazy and then die. That's their evolutionary directive. And so all of the food they consume is being converted into protein and nutrients and fats. So for let's start with kind of just the land usage,
Right.
because livestock takes up a lot of physical space, a lot of hectares of land, acres of land.
Exactly.
One of the great things about insects is that we can farm them modularly. I can have a box full of crickets that are growing, and then I can have another box of crickets on top of that, and another
Right.
box on top of that, and it works fine. You can't stack cows and pigs that way. It's not doesn't work out as well.
It's not very efficient.
So from a space efficiency perspective, we're able to save on a lot of physical land, which on two fronts. One, that means we're not having to clear natural areas to provide space to raise our animals. We don't have to cut down the rainforest. We don't have to cut down the parkland to make room for agriculture, because we can be so space efficient with it. The second thing is that all of that space that we're saving that's already farmland could then be used for more food for people.
Right.
So, imagine all of the additional vegetables and fruits that could be grown in all of that space that isn't being used for our protein production. Then when we get to feed efficiency, once again, they're just incredibly efficient compared to the livestock we already traditionally use. Generally speaking, and these will all be kind of broad strokes, because with insects, there are thousands of species that we know are edible, and thousands more that we haven't even looked at yet. And every insect species is going to be different in its nutrition and in its efficiencies, and how you raise them and what you feed them. All of these are going to change the amounts. But generally speaking, a cow, for instance, if you have 10 pounds of feed, you're going to get a pound of meat. If you have 10 pounds of feed, you're going to be getting 2 to 3 pounds of pork. You're going to be getting 4, maybe 5 pounds of chicken. And you're going to be getting like 9 pounds of crickets.
Right.
So they're able to just do a better job of turning that feed into food for us.
Yeah, they have a high feed conversion ratio.
Absolutely. And so, going back to the land idea, if we're able to, because so much of our farmland is not growing food for us, it's growing food for our food.
Right.
If we can reduce the amount of land that we have to use to grow food for our food, then we can grow food for people.
Right. And I mean,
plus, from a farmer's perspective, feed is generally speaking one of the highest costs in livestock. Eventually you'll pay off your land, eventually you'll pay off your animals, but your feed never gets paid off. It just keeps. They have to keep eating. So for farmers, this is a much more economically viable alternative. In water efficiency, we can provide some infographics so that you can share with the listeners a visualization of just how huge the difference is. But we're talking about insects being literally thousands of times more efficient at using their water to grow them to grow food. So instead of 20,000 gallons of water for a pound of beef, we're talking gallons.
Right.
Singular gallons of water for a pound of crickets. And again, we're only scratching the surface with these species like crickets and grasshoppers and mealworms that are kind of the pilot species being farmed right now. It could be that there are even more efficient insects in the Amazon rainforest that we just haven't discovered yet.
Yeah. So I mean,
and then lastly, the greenhouse gas emissions from livestock. You mentioned 18% of the global emissions from the livestock industry. A bunch of that is of course from the fossil fuels that are being used on all the machinery and the equipment, and a lot of that is the chemicals and things that are going into the feed production. But a big chunk of that is farts and burps. Yeah. Pigs and cows and chickens to a smaller amount produce a lot of emissions.
Yeah.
and there's a lot of reasons why. A big part of that is the diet that they're fed, but that's just a natural part of being a cow or a pig, is that you produce a lot of methane. When we look at insects, it's again, it is thousands of times less emissions to produce the same amount of food.
Right.
And again, that food is gram for gram more nutritionally dense.
And so you touched upon as well the idea of insects also being used, I guess, as a form of recycling, right? So the idea that what you're feeding insects can also, I mean, ignore all the other arguments, ignore the nutrition, ignore the greenhouse gas emissions. You also just have the simple fact that you can feed insects on organic waste streams.
Yeah. And there's still a lot of research going into really kind of how best to take that idea and put it into practical application. But there's already farmers that are looking at waste streams from a brewery, your spent grains and hops, right. Or the vegetable peelings and extra matter that comes from a veggie noodle factory, or even those fruits and vegetables that have expired and are no longer even salvageable for a food pantry. Right. Those kinds of things can be incorporated into an insect's diet. And beyond that, there are other species of insects that are farmed not for us to eat, but for our livestock to eat. Because right. If you think about a chicken's diet, a chicken naturally isn't going to be eating soy or fish, but soy and fish meal are the two primary proteins for poultry production. Yeah. And it's just because the chickens need that protein. If you have a free-range chicken, it's out there scratching in the dirt and eating bugs because that's its natural diet. So there are species like the black soldier fly. The larva of the black soldier fly is like a protein bar for chickens. It's right. Just perfectly designed for what they need. And it not only, it is a great feed for them, but then they produce, a better tasting egg because they're eating their natural diet. So we could be taking a lot of this food waste that we're producing that's, going into the landfill more often than not. Yeah. And in a best case scenario is being composted. But even when it's composted, we're losing a lot of those fats and proteins, those really valuable nutrients, just through the compost process. So by taking all of that food waste and feeding it to grubs like the black soldier fly larva, we're then able to very efficiently convert all that food waste into high-quality fats and proteins that can be used as the feed for the chickens or the pigs or the aquaculture.
Right, exactly. Aquaculture. I was just going to touch upon that. I mean, that's a whole new ballgame. I mean, I think it's up to almost half now, if not more, of the world's fish production comes from aquaculture, right? So, and there's this irony behind it, right? That aquaculture relies on fish meal, which consists, at least in part, of wild fish. So this is kind of vicious cycle. I mean, I know it's more complicated than that, but bringing insects into this kind of equation makes a lot of natural sense. I mean, also, from the perspective of, when you go fishing, for example, you often use bugs as a source of, as the feed to go fishing, right? So, you're not using, a broken down version of soy, let's face it. So, it just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and when we're talking about especially aquaculture and the necessity of using fish meal in that system, overfishing is a big deal and has been for a while and will continue to be a big deal. The number of collapsing fisheries around the world is astronomical while we're simultaneously increasing our fish consumption. Yeah. And which of course is what has led to the boom in aquaculture. But again, like you said, the issue is still that we're having to feed them wild fish. If we can feed them, even if we can supplement their diet in part with insects, that's that many more fish that we're not pulling out of the ocean.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think we should before we move on, we should definitely touch more upon the animal rights issue, especially because, I mean, you mentioned in terms of land, right? So when I think of the industrial livestock system, one of the big issues there is not just the fact that, it's deforestation and it's environmentally unfriendly, but just ethically speaking, it's horrendous, right? What they do to these animals, the conditions that they're living in. And that's if there's any reason to become vegan or vegetarian, that's the one, really, ethically speaking. So in terms of kind of land use and the space that insects have in an insect farm, I mean, how can you compare that to the livestock industry?
Well, so we we like to use the example of the 5 freedoms of animal welfare. And this is kind of a common litmus test for whether or not livestock production is ethical or humane. And it includes freedoms from stress and freedoms from pain and disease, freedom to have water and food, and freedom to exhibit natural behavior. And that's the one that's really interesting, because in all of our other livestock production systems, it's very difficult to design an efficient system that simultaneously allows the animals to exhibit that natural behavior. Exactly. And that's where we see that things butting up against each other in these industrial livestock production systems, is that you have these animals that are not designed to be kept compact and stacked on top of each other.
Yeah.
But with insects, that is exactly how they're designed. For instance, the crickets, that they are, for them, living in teeming, dark, humid, cramped conditions is amenable to exhibiting their natural behavior.
Right.
And I'm not saying you can cram all the crickets you want into one space and they'll be happy. There is the right balance.
Right.
But you can get a lot more of them into a space very efficiently and make it economically viable, because you have that ability to have that modular system. So when we're looking at insects, the idea of a free-range insect versus an insect that is farmed its entire life cycle inside of a system. If we allow our insects to be free-range, they're prone to predators, they're prone to parasites and diseases and bacteria.
Yeah.
Plus, who knows what our neighbors are spraying? They may be spraying pesticides or fungicides that get on them. There may be a refinery, a mile away, or a mine that has lead or mercury or heavy metals getting into the soil. So there's all these reasons why we don't want to allow them out there. And because we can farm them in a way that is amenable to their natural conditions, they're living like a 5-star cricket lifestyle their entire life. All they have to do is eat, sleep, make more babies. And then the beauty of it all is when it comes to harvest time,
right,
we can lower the temperature, and the insects, just like they would out in the wild in the winter when it gets cold, they will go into a natural hibernation state. And at that point, it's easy to lower the temperature further until they expire, and there's no change in state for the insects. There's no stressor. There's no pain to that death. In the way that really with any of other livestock, there's no truly humane way to raise and kill them like that. Yeah. So we have a really unique livestock in that regard.
Yeah, and I think in terms of space as well, I think what's interesting as well from the kind of opposite perspective is that it's from a farmer's perspective, it's much easier to rear, right? I mean, it's when you're talking about the possibility of, starting your own insect farm, in terms of investments. I mean, you're not talking, you don't need these acres of space. You don't need, it can be quite low tech. There's low capital investment options available. So it's widely available, to different communities around the world to try and to experiment with and to potentially even use as a source of income.
Yeah, and I don't want to overly glamorize the idea and say that insects are easy to raise,
right?
Because it is an animal, it is a living creature, it's a livestock, and just like any other livestock, the farmer has to understand the animal. But that being said, in a lot of ways, it is easier than any of other livestock options.
Right.
And it's something, like you said, you can really start at a very small level, and there's. On the one end of the spectrum, I raised for 9 months mealworms in my apartment in a couple of plastic trays, underneath my TV stand, and it was super easy. I would ignore them for a week at a time, and they'd be fine. And at the other end of the spectrum, you could have a giant, factory that is full to the brim of insect rearing systems. So you've got a way that a commercial. A large-scale commercial operation can produce a lot of food very efficiently. And then at the small end of the spectrum, you've got a way for people to literally grow their own food within their house or in their backyard. And this is great in the U.S. and in countries where it would be nice to be growing our own food in our backyard. But it's especially pertinent in a lot of these areas where it is a traditional food, and malnutrition is still such a big issue.
Right.
And we've seen some really great, grant programs through organizations like UNFAO, and some projects more recently like Meal Flour in Guatemala, where women are teaching Guatemalan women how to farm insects like mealworms and incorporate them into traditional dishes, even though mealworms are not traditionally consumed in Guatemala.
Right.
And the women in these communities love the idea because they get the nutrition and they see how easy it is. And they then can go back to their community and teach other people how to do it. And people can be raising their own food in their backyard. And in the areas of the world, parts of Africa and Southeast Asia, where insects are traditionally consumed and are most commonly wild harvested, on a seasonal basis, because the insects are prominent at one part of the year in one particular area.
Yeah.
This provides a way for people to raise those insects on a year-long basis. They can be growing their own food, and it has the potential to provide not just food security, but economic security for these people, because they can feed their family and they can take the other insects to the market, where in a lot of places these insects are fetching a higher market price than chicken, pork, or beef.
Right. Yeah, no, actually it's really interesting. I actually I grew up in Thailand. So what's really interesting there is in a lot of in the kind of street markets, when you're just walking around, crickets are very much a part of the diet there. And it's just interesting kind of seeing that here, like we mentioned, in the West, is still very much a developing idea. But on that, one of the issues or the concerns that I see is there a danger, I guess, of overexploitation, or of, I guess, industrializing this whole process, which to an extent up to now has been quite localized and has been quite based on traditional knowledge and on indigenous techniques. Is there a risk here that if we want to export this in the way that we've exported so many things to the West, that we end up kind of colonizing the process and somehow losing the sustainability of it?
Absolutely. And I think it's important for us to keep that top of mind as we're discussing this.
Right.
One of the things that we've stressed over the past few years is that we don't want this to become cultural appropriation. We don't want to be going somewhere and telling somebody how to do something when they have been doing it the same way for thousands of years, and it's been good.
Right.
But what we can do is work with those communities and learn from those communities, and then be able to work with them and determine how we can take those traditional practices of harvesting, and if it makes sense, look to domestication methods.
Right.
Because of the benefits of year-round availability, because of the benefits of increased production and availability, but also for reasons of biodiversity preservation. One of the interesting things we've seen over the past few years is that there are areas in the world where there are insects that are traditionally consumed and are now becoming endangered because they're being so over-harvested. So while we're never going to tell somebody not to go harvest an insect in the way that's traditional, it's important to take into account the risk of biodiversity loss. If more and more people are going out and harvesting them from the wild, then there's going to be less and less of them. And we've seen this in a lot of areas where now communities that literally relied on this food, it's been so overexploited that they're not able to get the amounts that they traditionally have. And so again, the ability to add domestication into the equation really unlocks a lot of potential for those communities. And for us, it's the same thing here. Of course, if I'm talking to someone in a city, I'm not going to tell them to go out and wild harvest an insect, because there's probably nowhere safe in that city that you can get a bug that's not covered in something.
Of course. If
you live out in the rural country, you're probably near farmland where something is being sprayed. It's really difficult to know that you're getting something from a pristine area. But if there are pristine areas, say there's an organic farm that doesn't have chemical use or anything like that, and grasshoppers are eating your crops, what if we can collect those grasshoppers and create two revenue streams from the same land?
No, that's really interesting, and I guess at the moment as well, one of the issues still, at least in the West, and I'd like to hear your opinion on this, is that it's still, I wouldn't say it's a fad, but it's becoming trendy, but it still seems kind of expensive, right? I mean, is that mainly because we haven't there's not enough knowledge yet, or there's an information shortage of how to do it most effectively? Or, I mean, talk to me about the kind of pricing behind it, and why is it that, at least when I bought insects, I thought, for this little amount that I got here, and we'll get into trying these later in the episode. I've been staring at them the whole time. But yeah, so why is it that they're still so expensive?
Well, so you hit on a couple of the reasons, and it's kind of an all of the above.
Right.
This industry is still in its infancy. There's a lot of comparisons, I think, to the poultry industry in the late 1800s.
Right.
In the late 1800s, early 1900s, poultry, if you lived in a city, you couldn't get chicken unless you were super rich, because it was grown in the country. It wasn't easy to transport it, and you could only breed chickens seasonally, one time a year. And it wasn't until the electric incubator was invented that chicken production was able to be done year round on a much more proficient basis. Right. And at that point, it becomes a more standard part of the American diet. So right now we're at that point where, compared to the dairy industry, the egg industry, the livestock industry, we are centuries, decades, if not centuries, behind in terms of R&D.
Yeah.
We have no idea what the optimal diet is. We have no idea what the optimal species is. We have we have all these questions that we're still in the process of answering. And that's the great thing about what a lot of these farms are doing. They're really diving into, how do we increase the efficiency? How do we incorporate technology and robots and mechanization and conveyor belts and, levers? How do we take all these components and put it into this farming system that is relatively low tech and labor intensive, and make it something that can work with today's economy? Here, at least in the U.S., we've inherited sort of a template of farming from the industry that farmed insects since the 50s for fishing bait and for lizard food and for bird treats. So we had an idea of how to do it, but most of that industry has remained pretty much the same for the past 50, 60 years. There hasn't been a lot of incorporation of technology. And so as we start to create these more efficient systems, the price point will drop. One of the other aspects is that it's there, without a huge amount of demand, there's not a lot of investment into the infrastructure. One of the other aspects is regulatory uncertainty. Because this is such a new idea in the Western food conception, there really have been no regulations around it because it's never come up before. And I know that you're there in Paris, I'm here in Austin. And if we look at some of the Western countries, the EU has a very, a much more strict rules around insects. And it's really only been in the past few years that it's gone from a strict no to, yes, you can do it as a novel food. Here's the way you have to do it. And it may be a long, complicated process, but at least you have a framework.
Right.
While here in the U.S., it's been much more of a Wild West. The FDA has been clear that you can use insects as a food if it's farmed specifically for food, and if you treat it just like you would any other food product. You have to adhere to current good manufacturing practices. You have to make sure that it's processed and packaged and transported and sold in compliance with the same rules that any other food has to follow. And it has to have that allergy warning, because at the end of the day, it has to be a safe, wholesome product for the consumer. Yeah. But they've said, if you do all of this, then it's a food. And so up until now, there's been a lot of regulatory uncertainty, and it's really only been in the last year that some of this has started to be really clarified. Yeah. And there's still some way to go before we have a really robust framework for regulating insects as a food or a feed. But we're already seeing, good milestones being hit. Canada last year in 2016 allowed black soldier fly larvae to be used as a poultry feed. The AAFCO here in the U.S., which helps inform the FDA on livestock feeds, has approved the black soldier fly larva as a salmonid feed. So we see the regulations. We see that things are going in a responsible way. It's good that things are being taken step by step and cautiously, because it's safe. Consumer safety has to be paramount. But at the same time, it's great that there are so many places where the regulatory authorities are saying, people obviously have been eating this around the world for thousands of years. And we have the capability of testing these food products to see if there's microbials, if there's E. coli or salmonella. We have the ability to test and see if there's chemicals like pesticides or heavy metals like mercury. So if we are able to make sure that it's done safely, we have a HACCP plan, a hazards and critical control points plan, to make sure that physical and chemical and other contaminants aren't getting into the system. We can do it in a way that creates a safe and wholesome food product.
That's great. I mean, I can't help but stare at these insects in front of me, and I think now would be a great time, as part of my kind of initiative of learning by doing on this podcast, that I give one a try, right? I think I should do so, especially before we move on to, I think, what's probably one of the main criticisms of eating insects, but I'm not sure it's quite a justified one, but it's definitely the one, and I think this is interesting for readers to hear about from you. It's the one from the University of California Davis study, right? So what I saw, I mean, and I think a lot of people tend to do this, is you have your doubts, you hear about this product, edible insects, it sounds fantastic. It sounds too good to be true, and so you Google something along the lines of edible insects unsustainable, and this is the first study that comes up. So before we kind of hopefully debunk, or at least challenge that that study, I'm going to give these a try. So I got in my hand here, I can't show you, but I got a cricket, which I think is flavored with dried tomato, so we'll give this a try. It's surprisingly good.
Yeah, and so these are and who is the maker of this product, so that your listeners can check out and see what you're actually eating.
All right, they are called Jiminy's, and they're really, really good. Yeah, I mean I can see the point though. I mean, I know we're veering off here a little, but I can see the point that people might be a little put off by potentially putting something like this in your mouth, because it does, very much resemble a cricket.
Absolutely. But we don't eat fish with the head on.
Right.
We don't take a bite out of a whole chicken. We don't even, when we eat shrimp, we take the head off. So there's all these other foods that we already abstract, and we don't think about the fact that we abstract them because it's just so common and normal. Right. And so it is very jarring, and it is very, almost confrontational for us to see something like that and put it into our mouth. But what we found as we've talked to thousands and thousands of people who have tried the insects for the first time over the last few years, all the events that we do, is that once you try it and you get that kind of reaction that you just did of, oh, okay, yeah. I mean, it's not like the best thing in the world, but it's also not squishy and gross.
No, not
it's
at all.
Not what I thought it would be, and it's really similar to other flavors and textures that I already know and love, whether that's nuts or chips or chicharrones or bacon bits or whatever.
Yeah, they've been flavored really well too. This is good stuff. So things like this, and that's Jiminy's, that's based there in France. I love what they're doing with these products like this, and they call them aperitifs. And the idea is that it's really similar to a bowl of peanuts or Chex Mix. Exactly.
It's the kind of thing that you can sit and snack on with a beer, or have with your tapas plate with some hummus and grapes and olives. So it's a really easy way to turn it into,
it's like a party snack,
snacky food, party food, Which of course I think is great, because it almost encourages like sharing, like oh, this is this is different than I expected. Let me see if someone else has that same reaction. Come over here and try this.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, they also do a protein bar that's made out of the cricket flour that is abstracted. So you're not going to see it. You're not going to taste it or feel it. All you're going to taste are the other flavors. Like, right. I think apple cinnamon is one of them. And it just tastes like any other protein bar. But because it has the insects, it has a better nutritional profile. And it has a smaller environmental footprint.
Yeah. And I like the fact that, I mean, we touched upon this already, but just the fact that, you're really eating head to tail. And I think that's one of the main criticisms a lot of people have as well about kind of the meat industry is the fact that you're not, you're throwing away so much of the animal. And here, at least, I can definitely see I am eating head to tail. So that's
absolutely. Well, and from a culinary aspect, that's also really interesting because for a chef, if I have a cricket, I'll have 3 crickets, and I'll feed one of them basil, one of them rosemary, and one of them mint.
Right.
I'm going to get 3 different tasting crickets.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Okay, before we get too excited, I really have to ask about this study because I know a lot of my readers will Google this and will say, see, there's the caveat. I knew it was too good to be true.
Yeah. And the great thing about this study is that when you look past the headlines, and really look at the study, it's still really inspiring. So to let your listeners know, UC Davis did a study where they looked at they were specifically looking at the feed efficiency. They were hearing all these claims about how sustainable crickets were and how they're even better than chickens, which are generally considered one of the most feed efficient livestock options. Which in part because chickens over the past 80 years have drastically changed.
Yeah.
They do not look at all like the chickens that were being raised in the early 1900s.
Or probably taste at all.
We've designed the chicken. And so they were saying this is a pretty tall glass of water. So they did 5 different feeds. And I believe it was ranging from a conventional chicken feed down to food waste byproducts down to straw and manure.
Right.
And at the end of the study, the results show that, not unsurprisingly, when you feed something straw and poop, it doesn't do very well. Big shock. But it also showed that when you feed crickets the chicken feed, they are just as efficient as chickens. They're not more efficient, but they're as efficient.
Right.
And that's a really important distinction because on the one hand, these are crickets that are being fed a chicken feed. So this is specifically formulated diet for chickens. Right. It's not a diet formulated for crickets. So there's the next study that needs to be done is let's do a cricket diet versus a chicken diet and see what the results are. Secondly, it didn't look at any of the other aspects. So at the end of the day, when I read this article, I come away and think, wow, crickets are just as feed efficient as our most feed efficient livestock option.
Plus all the other benefits.
They use less water. They produce less greenhouse gas emissions. They have a better nutritional profile. They're more humane. So at the end of the day, I walk out of this research and I go, yes, this is great. The fact that UC Davis, a very well-established research institution, was willing to look at this critically and came back with those results, that's inspiring for me. That just validates the idea. And of course, because you got to have a good headline, all of the articles were saying, it looks like crickets aren't as sustainable as we thought.
Yeah.
But none of them really bothered to look past that one. The encapsulation of the whole experiment was that if you feed them poop and straw, they die. And if you feed them chicken feed, they're as efficient as chickens. So, I think there's a lot of great takeaways to this, and it's inspiring to me to see this because it means that there will be graduate students who want to do further research on this, and they want to expand on these experiments. And that's really what we need as an industry. Going back to the price point, part of the reason why this industry is still, the products are still so expensive is because we don't have a lot of data. We haven't been doing this for very many years. And there's not a lot of incentive for one farm to share its data with another farm or one company to share its data with another company because it's such a small industry.
Yeah.
As the industry grows, as there's more research collaboration and prioritization, and the great news is that as an industry, there are already industry associations that are being formed specifically to encourage the growth of this industry. And in Europe, you have the IPIFF. I don't remember what it stands for, so you'll have to look it up yourself.
We can Google it.
It's a bunch of different edible insect companies. Some of them are insect feed, some of them are insect food, or insects for food, insects for feed. But as a whole, they're looking at how do we help get this product to the market in a way that's safe and is economically beneficial and nutritionally beneficial and environmentally beneficial for everybody.
Yeah.
In the UK, you have the Woven Network. There's a trade association starting in Southeast Asia. Here in North America, we have the North American Edible Insect Coalition, and we're able to, as a trade organization, talk to all the stakeholders in the industry and say, what are these questions? What is this research that we need to be doing? Because we know that there's still so many gaps that we have to fill.
Exactly.
Let's figure out, do we need to research the allergenicity? Because we know that there's a correlation. They're genetically similar. They have some of the same proteins as shellfish, but we really don't understand enough to have some, definitive ideas. With mealworms being the exception, the one research paper I've seen with mealworms showed a pretty definitive link between the allergy. But we need to do more research, so that should be a focus. That should be an area where we can put resources. The other thing that's great for the fact that the industry is growing to the point where it has these associations is we can be doing more broader public education and outreach.
Yeah.
Getting this information into the hands of dietitians and nutritionists and allergen experts, and as well as chefs and bakers and farmers and entrepreneurs. Getting this out there and legitimizing the idea so that investors are willing to invest in a company,
right? So
that governments are willing to invest in the infrastructure needed to create jobs for their local economy.
That's great. It sounds like there's so much potential here, and I think that must be really kind of the way forward, right? It's addressing these gaps, which are kind of a major impediment to this moving forward. And I guess to kind of finish off on in terms of what the listeners can do, right, to support this movement, to support the kind of initiatives that are being taken. What can your average Joe, your average person do to support edible insects?
So, of course, I'm going to recommend that they go to littleherds.org.
Of course, as they should.
And on there, we have a button that says, first time trying bugs, start here. And we use 3 core ideas that I think are great for, and these are really designed for kids because we do a lot of children's education. And, right. and real quickly, the reason why we focus a lot on children's education is because not only are children more open to the idea, they don't have the psychological taboo built up to the extent that you and I do have.
Yeah.
If especially the younger kids, 3, 4, they don't care what they're putting in their mouth as long as it tastes good.
Yeah.
If mom and dad are freaking out, that's a bonus. And so they're more open to new foods and trying things like this, but they're also the next generation of farmers and chefs and bakers and entrepreneurs that are going to, like I grew up normalized to the idea of sushi, are hopefully going to grow up normalized to the idea of insects as a food.
Yeah.
But because we do a lot of children's education, we're talking to children, we want to be safe. First and foremost, always safe. If you have a shellfish allergy, talk to your doctor first, and don't feed someone insects. Don't trick them into eating insects if you don't know what food allergies they have.
Right.
Let's be safe. Don't pick up a bug off the ground and eat it. That's not what we're talking about. We don't eat your bugs raw. We don't have sushi grade bugs yet. And after safe, you should be kind. You should be kind to other people. If you don't want to eat broccoli, I'm not going to bully you and poke you in the face with a broccoli stalk. Don't do that with bugs. If someone doesn't want to eat bugs, that's perfectly normal. That's perfectly okay. And we're not judging somebody just because they like a different food. You may not like shrimp, and they might not like peanuts, and they might not like kale. But we don't make fun of someone for that. and be kind to the planet. Look at your food and how it's grown and where it comes from. And this applies to not just insects, but all of your food.
Right.
You should always know where your food is coming from and how it affects the planet. And lastly, be kind to animals. Know, like we talked about, know how the animals that you're eating are raised. And with insects, understand why they're different. And then lastly, be curious, and this really, again, applies to not just insect cuisine, but to all of life. Be curious, be open to new ideas, be open to new flavors and foods and cultures and experiences, and be open to learning new things and trying new things. And that's really core in how we try to get people to approach it. We want to create an environment where this is a very approachable thing that's very fun and exciting and experiential, and it's something that you can do as a group and have a good time. And in that way, giving people that first bite, that first opportunity, and really celebrating kind of that event, because we're celebrating people breaking down their own taboos.
Yeah. Yeah, there's something really exciting about just the idea of kind of trying something new, something exciting, and kind of knowing that it has this positive impact and that it's contributing to a movement that we really need. And this is something, to end on, that I'm super passionate about. I mean, half the reason why I started this podcast was very much to kind of addressing the livestock industry situation, addressing the kind of food on your plate and learning about what's behind it, right? And insects, for me, to finish off, it really kind of encapsulates that. You've got the rearing element, the animal rights element, you've got the environmental element, you've got the exploring element, you've got the research element, you've got the pioneering element, and you bring it all together with, taking bits from traditional knowledge from, indigenous cultures, and at the same time adapting it to Western standards. And I think we have a really kind of unique opportunity there that, it hasn't been kind of spoiled by, Western corporations and patents and all of that yet. And we really have a kind of opportunity to kind of take this and make it something sustainable. So I really, really love what you guys are doing at Little Herds and other organizations around the world that are kind of raising the awareness, because I guess that's where it really starts, and that's still the phase that we're at. It's the information, it's breaking down the taboos, and it's making it accessible to to ordinary people.
So absolutely, and so my second suggestion to the listener, after you go to littleherds.org, you learn a little bit more. You'll be able to find all sorts of different ways that you can try it. Your second thing you should do is try it.
Right.
Give it a try, see what you think, and then share it. Share it with your friends, your family. Share it online. Tag Little Herds. We love sharing people's recipes, their photos, their videos. What you really just so well touched on one of the most amazing aspects of this industry, but really this community and this movement, is that it is a new industry, and therefore it's not entrenched in so much of the baggage of so many of our industries. There's no old boys club. There's so much sharing. There's so much openness. There's so much collaboration. It's really a unique, almost even footing, clean slate of a potential. And so being, getting people at a grassroots level to engage in the idea, it spreads it exponentially. And it's a really incredible thing. We're talking about in the past, 4 or 5 years, this has gone from a fear factor, survival, scorpion lollipop novelty gag gift to not a silver bullet. I don't want anybody to think that we're preaching that bugs are going to save the world.
Right.
We're not. But it's a piece of the puzzle, and it's a piece of the puzzle that fits with so many other pieces of the puzzle. and one of the last things I'll leave you with is that, going back to, we're not trying to get everybody to eat bugs. We don't need everybody to eat bugs. If we get such a small number of people eating bugs, we can have an outsized impact. If we convinced 1% of the U.S. population, call it roughly 3.2 million people, and we convince them to substitute 1% of their annual meat consumption, not including fish, That's about 125 pounds the average American eats of non-fish meat a year. So let's say 1.25 pounds over the next year. That's really easy to do if you're eating crickets in a protein bar, in a pasta, in a shake, in a smoothie. You can add it into a lot of different foods in a lot of different ways and easily hit 1.25 pounds of insects over a year.
Right.
At the end of that year, 1% of people substituting 1% of their meat, that's like 4 million pounds of insects that would be consumed. That's like tens of thousands of gallons of water that aren't being used.
Right.
That's, thousands of metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions that weren't produced. And that's a lot of extra nutrition. So it's something that I think it's really inspiring that it's going to take such a small number to create such a big impact. And I think we're very quickly approaching that tipping point where we hit that bright line where it stops being something that's a novelty or a fad, and it becomes something like sushi that is just a normal thing.
Exactly. I love it. I'm excited. I'm going to enjoy the rest of my bowl of crickets here. They are very tasty. RNA, thanks so much for joining us today. This has been an awesome discussion, and I feel a new faith in humanity once again.
It's been such a pleasure, and thank you so much for letting us come and share, and really excited to share this out with all of our followers.
Well, there you have it, guys. A wonderful conversation with the one and only RNA from Little Herds. If you're as excited about edible insects as I am and you want to give them a try, or if you just want some more information, you can head on over to the littleherds.org website, as RNA suggested. You can also find more information by clicking on any of the links in the description below on this podcast episode. If you like this episode or any of the other episodes, the way you can support this podcast is by liking, reviewing, and rating our podcast on iTunes, by liking our Facebook page, following us on Twitter and Instagram, or by just sharing it with friends and family that you think might be interested. That's it for now, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in to this week's episode. I'll see you next week.